I think we are going to start. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yuri Shevchuk. I am the founding director of the Ukrainian Film Club at Columbia University. Today is our second event in the season of 2020-2021, and it's a special event because it's special in at least two aspects. Number one, that for the first time we are doing it in this pandemic format as a webinar on Zoom, and number two, and that's a positive aspect, that we have the director of the film with us, which is always our ideal kind of option of having an event to discuss her film. Before I introduce the director, I would like to kind of lay out the rules of our discussion. Attendees on Zoom can use the Q&A tab to submit written questions, and viewers on YouTube can use the live chat if they are logged in to a YouTube account, because we are live streaming on YouTube as well. After another minute or so, I'd go ahead and get this started, which I have already started. I just read a prompt. Today's event is, in a way, and I can say it without a stretch of imagination, a premiere. And the question is whether it's a New York City premiere or a New York State premiere or a national premiere or international premiere. But this is a first time that this feature documentary by Katya Soldak is going to be screened, is going to be discussed. It has already been made available for viewing for you. And a few words about our guest, Katya Soldak. Katya approached me about a year ago with kind of an offer of the film that she was finishing. And we had a very interesting conversation, and I was immediately intrigued because the issues that she said she discusses in the film were of utmost pertinence to what is going on in Ukraine, what is happening with Ukrainians around the world, and also with what I have been interested in for years as an instructor at Columbia University and as a lecturer who speaks a lot on issues of Ukrainian identity, culture, what it means to be Ukrainian, what is happening in Ukraine now, both in Ukraine and in the United States. So I really jumped on the offer, kind of to use the Ukrainian proverb, buying a cat in the bag without even seeing it, because the film at that time, the film was not even ready. But of course, when I saw the film, it surpassed my expectations. I got very enthusiastic, and today I'm very happy that we, after having seen it, we can discuss the film and the issues that the film touches upon and looks at with you and with the film director. So Katya Soldak is a New York-based journalist, born and raised in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. Katya works as an editorial director for Forbes magazine's international editions, having previously toiled, her word, in the world of documentary production at CBS News Productions and various production houses in New York City. At a Columbia School of Journalism alumna, she has interviewed high-profile politicians and artists and has written cover stories for Forbes about Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs. Katya is the author of the memoir essay entitled "This is How Propaganda Works," about growing up in the Soviet Union. She's a founding member of the Diverse Filmmakers Alliance, a collective of award-winning filmmakers in New York from all backgrounds, working to diversify the filmmaking landscape. In a regular situation, I would say, let's give a round of applause to our guest, but I suppose I will be representing all of you by doing that round of applause. So Katya, welcome to our discussion. Congratulations on a great film. I like it, and I know that a lot of people already like it. And my first question to you to start the discussion, what brought you to making the film? I mean, being a journalist is one thing. Being a filmmaker is a little bit different. Was there in your life experience a singular event that was a trigger that when you had that trigger and you decided, okay, I made up my mind. I need to make a film about that, not write an essay, not write a story for publication in print, but to make a film. What was that, if there was such a thing? What brought you to making the film?
Thank you, Yuri, for this wonderful introduction, and thank you for considering my film and watching the film. And I'm really happy to be here with all of you, although I cannot see you. And the question that you asked is, I don't know if there is one way to answer it, but I'm going to try to be on point as much as possible. I would say there was a moment when I started filming, and it was the Orange Revolution. But when I look back, I think I was somehow subconsciously, or I don't know how, but I was always documenting something that was happening, whether it was my life or life around me. When I worked in the 90s for this TV station in Kharkiv, I never tossed any tapes away. I kept all of them, maybe not all of them, but the most interesting. So I had huge archives of some stuff that nobody really cared about. I didn't know what for, but I carried those boxes. They used to be like VHS tapes, and I even brought them to America, and they were sitting, and I moved and I never lost them. So there was this kind of strange need to document things. And because I worked for that TV station, visual and video was always that sort of form of way for me to work with. So it wasn't just information, I collect mentally songs or whatever, it's like three-dimensional sort of archiving or documenting way. But when the Orange Revolution happened, I had a friend who is not with us today. She now lives in Europe, who was more into documentary making. And she said, there is great stuff happening in Ukraine. She's Japanese, by the way. She's not Ukrainian in any way. But I guess the Orange Revolution was this moment when people looked at Ukraine and started processing what's happening. And it was a big uprising everywhere in the news. So she had a camera, and we got together and we went to Ukraine, and we started asking questions and documenting things. And the way it worked, that the story was not complete, because I thought that it would be a story, and I was, much more naive about things and less experienced. So I thought that we're just going to make this film, and it's going to be this great film about this new country that just went through this uprising. They chose the great president, and there's going to be happy ending. And by the time I screened all the tapes, which took some time, it was already clear that the story is not adding up to whatever the premise was at the beginning. So that was the beginning of my journey with the film. So I would say maybe that time was the moment when I started working on the film. But I think overall, somehow I always had that need to keep some documentation or representation of what I was living through, including my life in the 90s, which at that time I was so young. I had no idea that people are making documentary films. I was just compulsively collecting the material.
You are a journalist here, and you have worked as a journalist here in New York, and you are submerged in that environment. And did the level of information about Ukraine among your colleagues and among wider kind of society here in New York in any way played into your decision of making a film? Like, these people don't know enough about what's going on. I need to tell this story to them because there's such a vacuum or lack of information. Was that also a factor?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing is that I can be completely honest with everybody here. I didn't know much about Ukraine other than what I knew by living there. Obviously, I had some good, because I was already studying after the Soviet Union collapsed. So I had history teachers who taught me about Ukraine, but I didn't know how to put it into any context. So when I started going back to Ukraine, I was learning as I was interviewing different people. And when I came back to America and I lived here, people didn't know much about Ukraine. And just like you say, you know, there was vacuum, but I was also curious to learn for myself as well. And then later, when I started understanding a little bit better, even maybe in 2010, 2011, when I noticed what Russia is doing, how they were suppressing the media freedom, and Ukraine was doing something else. At that time, I think it was really clear that there is not much information, and the dots are not connected, and people do not remember much going back like 5 years after that, or 3 years. It was before Twitter explosion. So 2-3 years was already like completely new cycle. Nobody remembered anything. Now it's even shorter. And at the end, when I started putting puzzles together for the story, the intention was actually to give a bigger picture and also give more information about my country and the context and everything that surrounds it. Because the news buzz, it comes and goes, but this is a very different way to tell the story of Ukraine.
When I travel in Ukraine, and every year up until the outbreak of this pandemic, I would spend 3.5 months in Ukraine and speak a lot publicly and privately. And oftentimes people would tell me, people who don't know me mostly, that, well, you are there and we are here and you don't understand us. There's no way you can really understand us. So making a film about Ukraine and being physically here, was it an advantage or a disadvantage for you?
Well, you know, my mom is there. She lives there. She's the one who's completely not corrupt by the American ideas. She's not leaving Ukraine. She likes Ukraine. That's her home. So she was the character, one of the characters that had a very, very local perspective. And, you know, I didn't really change. I mean, whatever she was saying, it's in the film. I didn't alter anything to support a certain point of view. But yeah, I mean, I live here. What can I do? I mean, at some point it was actually an advantage because they did not understand that my friends, my family, they did not understand that they were living through something historic. And I always felt that something was happening. And again, I didn't really know, like nobody could foresee Maidan, for instance, in 2013. But between the Orange Revolution and then when Yanukovych was elected, I was coming back with this camera because I also worked as a video journalist. So I had this equipment. I didn't need to make a huge production out of it. And I was interviewing them and they were laughing at me. They were like, oh, you're so American. Why are you doing this? You want to do this interview again? Okay, fine. But like, it's all nonsense. But I felt that there was something happening. I just didn't know where it was all leading. And I don't think I would feel this way if I lived there, because then you get too immersed into your day-to-day, you know, unless you're a political analyst or something, but, you know, I'm not. And yeah, so it's great. I mean, plus I travel to Ukraine all the time. I forgot to say that there were a couple of years when I went to Ukraine, maybe over the course of 18 months, I probably went like 8 times or maybe even more. So, and I'm not just going there to sit and eat and just, you know, relax. I talk to people, different kinds of people. So maybe, yes, I live in America. Yes, I've been here for 20 years, and I'm sure from people who live in Kharkiv, the perspective is like average, you know, people, like, what does she know? She's so Americanized. And yes, probably I am Americanized, but it doesn't mean that I can't hear and see and listen to people who live there to stay true.
Well, Americanized or not, I would just take it with a grain of salt, because teaching at Columbia and then before that at Harvard, I met so many students from Ukraine whose life stories were somewhat different to yours. They were born into a Russian culture environment in Ukraine and Russian language. They spoke Russian, and they found their Ukrainian identity here in the United States. It took them moving to the United States and settling here to realize that they are Ukrainians and not Russians, to such an extent that they became a very, very proactive about and affirmative about that they decided to learn the language, Ukrainian language that they didn't think much of, being in Ukraine and hearing it around them. And suddenly they want they realize that that's a missing link. They want to be Ukrainian, including they want to speak the Ukrainian language. So for many people, moving outside of Ukraine meant finding their Ukrainian identity. And I think your film is in some important way also about that, is it?
Well, yeah, because actually there was an episode that was in the film, but then I had to take it out because the film was already 1 hour and 20 minutes long and not everything was adding to the story. But the first time when I actually came to the States, it was in 1998. And I was on a cultural exchange trip, and I went to Ohio, and we had students working as camp counselors in the summer from a lot of, post-Soviet countries and like Hungary, East Germany. And there were a couple of people from Russia. And without even like spending a second, I knew right away that I was not from Russia. It was absolutely clear when we did cultural presentations or we were doing introductions. They were talking about matryoshkas and cold winter, and I brought a whole bunch of clay Cossacks with me as souvenirs for new friends, and some Ukrainian language magazines about Ukrainian bands, because I thought that would be somehow intuitively, I just wanted to talk about that. And it was very clear I was Katya from Ukraine, and they were like Julia and whoever from Russia. So yes, that was probably the first time when I had to start saying that I'm from Ukraine, because I would never say, even in 1998, I wouldn't say I'm from Russia. It just was nonsense to me. Maybe because I worked in media and we already completely separated in many ways from Russian television at that time or Russian music. But when I started meeting Ukrainians from diaspora who spoke Ukrainian, who knew Ukrainian artists and Ukrainian, historic figures that I probably was not familiar, or writers, of course I felt uncomfortable. I was not sure if I belong. I didn't want to feel like pseudo-Ukrainian, but I felt all those things. And last but not least, with the language, even though I намагаюсь to speak Ukrainian, but I did voiceovers in Ukrainian since pretty much the first year when I came here, because I could read Ukrainian, and with a little bit of preparation, I would get my emphasis right. So I was doing voiceovers for a lot of these like local recording studios for like phone answering systems or airlines or infomercials in Ukrainian. So even though I couldn't really speak, but I liked the language, and I liked that I had the ability to speak Ukrainian, to read Ukrainian.
And our participants are warming up slowly. We have 2 questions from the audience. Alicia Shenduk from Boston is writing, your documentary about you and your mother and stepfather's journey toward a Ukrainian identity covers a very timely topic. How widespread do you think this change among Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine, especially in the last 5 years?
I think after the Maidan revolution, that was a pretty common thing to do. I know that we have a couple of people here in the audience from Dnepropetrovsk or Dnipro, I know that we had a chat, they're my friends, and they said that they felt similar things because it's a very, Russian speaking city from what I understand, but the identity switched towards Ukrainian. I think the change was coming after the Orange Revolution, but it wasn't as profound. But I think the Maidan Revolution really made it clear that Soviet is no longer part of our culture, of Ukrainian culture, and the identity became more Ukrainian.
And to add to this, it seems like a tendency that is visible both at the grassroots levels, but most importantly at the level of culture-producing elites. And increasingly we see people of recognized talent publicly and on principle switching from their mother tongue Russian to Ukrainian, almost in a categorical way. There's a Volodymyr Rafeyenko from the Donbass who, after the Russian aggression, before that, he was feted and recognized with the highest literary prizes for his Russian language writings and novels in Moscow and everything, and he switched to Ukrainian. And what he writes in Ukrainian is absolutely fascinating, also in the sense that is like no other experience of reading modern Ukrainian literature, because he writes in Ukrainian and he shares with the reader the taste of the language that is emotionally his, but that he is in the process of acquiring. And this is something absolutely unknown to me as a reader of Ukrainian literature. I can't think of anybody else doing that to the reader. So I ask you to make a kind of mental notch for Volodymyr Rafeyenko. He's well worth reading. And we hope to have him over at Columbia at one point. There's another literary sensation who also is a kind of an example of such a conversion or recovery of the lost Ukrainian identity. And I'm not even saying ethnically speaking. It's a, if you want, political identity, because for instance, I'm talking about Valery Ananyev, who is, I suppose, is Russian, part Russian or fully Russian. At least he has a Russian name. He is a veteran of Ukrainian-Russian war, a paratrooper, and he wrote best-selling tracks on the road, "Сліди на дорозі," that is now out of print. It's so popular that several of the prints of this novel, his first novel, were literally vanished within a blink of an eye. I tried to order it today over as a mail order, and it's not available there, waiting for its print. And he has 300,000 subscribers as a very popular blogger. He now speaks only and emphatically and categorically Ukrainian. And he explores in an incredibly interesting, but also very delicate way, what it means to be Ukrainian, inviting all kinds of people to converse with him. And that's Valery Ananyev, the tracks on the road, "Сліди на дорозі." That's just an example. We have a question from Marina Prichodko, your землячка from Kharkiv, and I'm proud to say my former student at Columbia University. She took Ukrainian language courses with me, and I quote, "I love the film. As a native of Kharkiv, I could relate to a lot, even at the moments when I had to shut my eyes from secondhand embarrassment. Based on some of the footage pre-2013, it seemed like you, Katya, were always filming the story of your life, and Euromaidan was the moment that helped you form a documentary. Is that how it happened?"
Well, you know what, Marina, I think you are absolutely right, because the reason why I was continued to film I wasn't filming. I can actually, if I have a few moments, I can tell you how it morphed into the story about my life. I didn't want to be in a film. Like, I am a journalist, you know, since very, you know, young age, like my daughter's age, because that's how we rolled in Kharkiv. You just graduate from high school and boom, you go and become a journalist. So I never really liked to talk about myself or expose my family or myself to any stories. And I was filming as a journalist. I would do like interviews, talking heads. I had a variety of experts, and I was putting something together, rough cut. I would show it to people. It never felt quite compelled. And also the story was not complete, because if the story was about Ukraine was always transitioning into something. By the time I finished filming, there is already like new president and some new disaster, and you don't know where it's all going. So I kept filming. But before the Euromaidan, I made a trip to the west of Ukraine, and I interviewed several people there. So I was hoping to kind of complete my journey that I started a long time ago. And that didn't work either. Like, no matter from which angle I was coming, it was not a compelling film. And then the Maidan happened in 2013. And then the war happened. And then Crimea was annexed. And then Donbass was occupied. And then people changed. My own family changed. My mom changed. My stepfather, who is so set in his ways, and even he started questioning something. So that was the turning point when the film was completed, in the sense that I knew where I was going. But, you know, as you edit the film, and maybe some of you worked in film, just because you have something to say doesn't mean that it's an engaging way. So I was screening it with my DFA, this Diverse Filmmakers Alliance. And it was a great place to workshop rough cuts. And they were pushing me to put more of myself in it. And I was like, okay, fine. I already gave you something. The next cut I bring, or the next scene, they like, we want to know more. Why were you doing this? Why were you doing that? So that's how they dragged me into it. And fortunately, I had enough footage of myself, enough footage of myself to put it in the film. But some of it was just shot purely as a, like, just we have a camera, so let's just film whatever.
Very well. We have a question from Benjamin Cohen, and I quote, "Speaking of cultural production, music seems to have played a great role in your life and career. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you put together the soundtrack for the film? What was the process, and do you have any favorite musical selections from the soundtrack?"
Thank you so much for this question, because I actually worked on the soundtrack for a while. I had a wonderful sound designer from Ukraine, Andriy Borisenko, and then a wonderful composer, Sasha Gusev, who he lives in Moscow now, but his family is from Kharkiv, and his father was the main conductor for the Kharkiv Opera House, something to that extent. So he had a very strong connection, and he wrote the music and also did the arrangements with the songs that I wanted to use. And the songs that are in the film, they basically just, as I kind of progressed, there were songs that made sense for a certain period of time, or songs that I liked. The one that's opening the film, Vesna by Vopli Vidoplesova, it was one of these things. It's like an insight. You just don't even know how. You just put a song, and I edit a little bit myself. So even though we had this great editor, Olga Lvov, who finished the film, the like little scenes, I put them together myself. And that was just something that just happened in a split second, and it stayed for the rest of the production process. And I think it worked very well. And Vopli Vidoplesova are very dear to me, because I interviewed them back in like 1997, when Kharkiv had its first Chervona Ruta festival in the square. So I have photos with him when I'm like basically a child, and some little articles. So everything in that film makes sense, not just for me, but I think it also represents some turning points, and even just Soviet songs. For instance, when there's a scene when my dad is playing a guitar, and there's a song from this film, The Fate of, what is it, The Irony of the Fate, or Have a Nice Bath. It's this famous film that all the Soviet people watched every year on New Year's Eve. This is a Soviet theme. There are still Soviet songs playing everywhere in all these post-Soviet countries, and they appeal to certain generations. So in a way, it's like unification of many lives that were, after the Soviet Union went in different directions. Some became Belarusians, some became Ukrainians, but there is this very firm cultural past that they all share, and it also made its way into the film through music. Then there is a hip hop band. When I'm showing the scene of my neighborhood, that's kind of like, looks like some ruins, and there's a woman in a pink tracksuit crossing this, little area, courtyard, and there is a hip hop music playing. That's something modern. There is a band from Lviv or somewhere Western Ukraine that records these songs. So I naturally just wanted to I would put more, but songs are so expensive to use in films. So I just had to work with what I could do. And then the wind of change, of course. I don't know, Yuri, you might, I want to ask you later about your experience in the 90s, but come on, the wind of change was the hymn of that time. It was like the band that was, playing and symbolizing the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I really wanted to have that in a film, even though I was told that I can't and it's too pricey. We found ways to incorporate it without breaking any rules, but without licensing it. Oh, oops, what did I just say?
I didn't hear you.
I didn't say anything, but I'm just joking. Everything is done completely by law, so that song is there. And thank you again for this question. I mean, I appreciate that somebody noticed the soundtrack.
We have a question from Basil Lvov, and it goes, I will edit it for length and for modesty, because there are some compliments for me. I'll skip them. Thank you, Basil. I had the pleasure of watching the film several times, and each time it was a pleasure. So hats off, Katya. I'd like to ask about the stances of two of the film's characters, how they changed, if they did, after 2014. A friend of yours, I believe his name is Maxim, the one who supported Yushchenko and is into the doors of and Morrison, just like you, says in the film that Ukraine got no future. Another character says he wants the Russian Empire back. What are they saying now after the annexation of the Crimea, the war Russia started, and all other things?
Thank you for your question, Basil. I think that it's harder for me to answer this question than others because as many people experienced, I also experienced some falling out with my friends. And the guy who wanted Russian Empire, I no longer speak to them, so I don't know how their views changed. We had a kind of clean breakup after Crimean annexation and the invasion. Maxim, he retreated into music. He basically found his escape playing guitar and traveling, actually, because he was one of the characters who really wanted to travel and he couldn't because you needed to get visa to go even to Czech Republic at that time. And now after the Maidan, when they created visa-free regime and Ukrainians can freely travel, that's what he's doing. But I think Maxim is more of a just kind of disillusioned, naturally skeptic person, just like many people in Kharkiv, actually. So I would say that he's not pro-Russian or anything in that sense, but he found some other outlets for himself.
But it's his image or his character is representative of an entire category of Ukrainian citizens who connect their valuing Ukraine to a particular political figure, as opposed to having an unconditional attachment, dedication, and love for the country whatever happens. Never mind what any politician promises, but whether he succeeds or fails, it's not going to change my attachment to Ukraine as my motherland. That's one view. And those people who are wobbly, they still don't know who they truly are. They are looking for their identity. They very often attach their valuing Ukraine to a particular project, a particular political program, and a particular political figure like Yushchenko. And so Yushchenko failed in many ways, not in all, but in many ways, or in most ways. He was a disappointment. And it was and that disappointment kind of pushed those people away from Ukraine as a country, as if Yushchenko is Ukraine. And so it's a very interesting, you hit the nail on the head featuring this guy, because he illustrates that kind of, I would say, rather curious attitude or relationship or a kind of dynamic between the country identity and a particular person.
I think you're exactly right. And also in Kharkiv, and maybe it's the same in Odessa or Dnipro, I don't know about those cities, but people in Kharkiv, they like to say that I'm a citizen of Kharkiv. Like, this is my universe, this is my country. And in a way, it's easier for them. They don't have to side with anybody. They just live in this city, which is pretty big and diverse and has a lot going on. And they have like local humor, local fashion, local, whatever. And it's easier for them to just say, we are the citizens of Kharkiv, and that's all. Maybe now, I would say, after Maidan, there is still a big movement towards Ukrainian identity, but people, especially that generation like Max, they are, I would say, in their like mid-40s now. They've seen so many changes, and they just naturally protect themselves instinctively, just trying to stay out of disappointments because they just engaged too much with the Orange Revolution, or then put their hopes into Poroshenko, and now they just want to play guitars.
And we have some participants from YouTube who are watching our streaming on YouTube. And that's a question from journalist Irena Chalupa from Washington. And I quote, Katya, the long breakup. Who is breaking up with whom, and why is it such a long breakup?
Thank you so much for your question. I don't know why it's such a long breakup. I mean, you tell me, somebody has to tell me why it's such a long breakup, because if it's the breakup between two countries, which most likely I'm inclined to think that's the breakup, I don't know how long this breakup is going to go on. And I mean, it's really not over yet. Hopefully it will be over someday. But it's also my own breakup with the past, or with Ukraine. I mean, I'm not breaking up with Ukraine, but the past, the Soviet past, it's in the past. It's also a breakup of my mother with Russia, because we did have very strong ties with Russia. That little countryside thing, it was just like a Mecca. It was like a real place where you go and you escape and you're happy. And it's no longer that place, and nobody wants to go there. That's a breakup. And it's not just my mother. There are millions or thousands of other people who had their personal breakups. So I hope I answered the question. But in terms of why is it such a long breakup, I really wish I knew.
Very well. And I have another question from Gabriela Gonzalez. And I quote, this may be too personal, but how does your culture impact your relationship with your daughter? The dynamic between you and your mom was so brilliant throughout the film, and it really brought the film together in a perfect way. However, the scene when you were in MN and speaking with Ukrainian Americans, it seemed to leave you questioning specific details about your cultural identity. If anything, do you think your daughter will have a stronger connection to Ukrainian culture because she's being raised here in the United States with you and your mom as primary sources and the transformation you and your family went through inside and out?
Oh, I don't know how to answer this question. It's so complicated. Thank you so much for asking complicated questions. I mean, I wish my daughter could answer parts of these questions herself, because we occasionally have interesting identity discussions, and I still don't know exactly where she stands. I know that she loves Ukraine. If Diana is still there, I'm sorry for speaking on your behalf, but I know that she wrote essays for school about Maidan, and she speaks up, or used to speak up in her classes when somebody would say Russia, meaning Ukraine. I mean, like the teacher teaching high schoolers would say that. Of course, she couldn't watch that in silence. But culturally, I mean, honestly, what do I know? I am from this generation, from the Soviet Union, to her, it probably looks like it's from like 1935. So my opinions occasionally seem so outdated, and it's partially cultural and partially because Soviet Union was so different from anything in the Western world that she really has this like carte blanche, like, you know, this is the Soviet Union and this is the Soviet Union speaking whatever I'm saying. Maybe there is a part of a question that I didn't answer, but I maybe didn't. If you help me, what I didn't answer, I would like to continue.
Well, she'll come back. We have more questions. One is from Nestor Fedik, and I quote, "Thank you for the film. It made me relive some moments from the recent history. All characters except you are based in Ukraine. Were you tempted to include some people based in the United States of Ukrainian descent?"
Thank you, Nestor, for that question. Let me think for a second. I mean, I did include these people from Minneapolis. There was a scene when I traveled to Minneapolis and I discovered this Ukrainian community back in 2012, I think it was. So I let them, I mean, of course I had a lot more. It just couldn't include everything in the film. But I was basically shocked by how connected they are to the culture, how well they speak Ukrainian, how much they know. They do Ukrainian dancing, they do pisankas, they do all these traditions that I, growing up in the Soviet Union, did not have. Maybe later it was all available, but not when I was there and when I was going to school. So it was very interesting to see that, but because I wanted to focus on Ukraine, I couldn't give them proper space. I did make a short video about making pisankas with Luba Pleshchichin from Minneapolis. It was a standalone piece, but I couldn't include a lot of that in the film because I wanted to focus on Ukraine.
And a question from Jane S. I quote, the contrast between your mom and stepfather's evolving identity and some of your former friends' unwavering association with Russia, and even a radical thought about bringing back authoritative government was powerful. You have been able to dive deeper into what was grounding their beliefs. Was there more than three? Was there more than the influence of the Russian propaganda?
Thank you, Jane, for this question. I honestly, I don't know if it's the influence because they grew up in the Soviet Union and that's what their mindset is like. My stepfather, I think his mom is from Western Ukraine. I also had interviews with her that didn't make it into the film. She speaks fluent Ukrainian. She is, all the family is there, but his beliefs were formed by his experience in the Soviet school. And then he was this communist leader at this plant where he worked. So I think he was more or less designed to think that like Ukraine, Russia, it's all the same and question everything. I honestly remember fights with him where he would blame Obama for everything. You know. Yeah. So I mean, there's also a big information war too. And seriously speaking, I think this is the most dangerous thing about what's happening in Ukraine and now in America, on American soil too. This propaganda is no longer just, you know, black or white. It attacks you in very intricate ways, targeting specifically your weaker spot. And, you know, you can be believer in free Ukraine, but then they somehow get into your head and start thinking like everybody's like representing something, you know, if these guys are pro-Russian, then the other ones must be pro-American, like they're like the Soros, you know, they blaming Soros and his funds. So the information war never stopped. It's still there. It just became a little bit more sophisticated. And I would imagine that even though somebody was leaning towards, you know, being more like, okay, I'm Ukrainian, everything is fine, I'm not thinking about Soviet anymore. And then like next year, there is a round of some little pieces, some documentaries, a little bit of cultural, like a TV show that glorifies the Soviet Union, where like the interiors do not look as ugly as they, or poor as they actually used to be, but they kind of look nice and clean and just stylized. And they're like, okay, maybe the Soviet Union wasn't that bad. So maybe Russia is not, oh, these are just political wars. And it messes with people's heads and beliefs. People were never left alone to form their own identity in the East. In the West may be different. I don't know how much time we have, but Yuri, I think I really want to ask you about your experience. I know you're asking me questions, but based on some of the feedback, especially what Nestor said, I would like to hear a little bit from you. How did you experience the 90s and the separation from the Soviet Union? Because you are from the opposite side of Ukraine. Where are you from exactly? What is the name of your town?
Well, exactly the opposite side. I'm from northwestern Ukraine, which is Volyn, the province of Rivne. I'm not from a big city. I'm not even from a city. It's a small town of 6,500 people. But you would be surprised that your film resonated with me because it was also about me, because that's what I went through with a difference in 20 years, perhaps. I grew up in cultural environments completely russified mentally, in the sense that I thought Russian language and culture were the best in the world. I absolutely loved Russian literature, and I could quote from memory Pushkin, Lermontov, you name it. And I felt deeply unfortunate having been born a Ukrainian, because I had to speak this language that was Surzhyk and that I was ashamed of. And so for me, I underwent a kind of a similar journey from being this product of Soviet brainwashing and propaganda to becoming a proud and self-conscious Ukrainian who had no doubts in the inherent value of the culture, of the language, and of the identity. And in that sense, I want to bounce the question, but I did that transformation even before the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Oh, yeah.
But yes, but very much like you, because your transformation was probably facilitated by external factors like Russian aggression and the violence perpetrated on you, if not directly physical violence, but the violence that was symbolic, that you felt, the realization that your country is being invaded and parts of it annexed, and that was a kind of a facilitator that sped up your becoming or your recovering your Ukrainianness. For me, there was also that kind of external factor, the symbolic violence of contempt that I felt to myself when I went to study in Kyiv at Kyiv University and spoke Ukrainian, and I felt this aggression every step of the way that made me into a Ukrainian. I refused to go along with that, and I asked myself, am I really a representative of a nation of idiots that they want me to believe? Is Ukrainian language is really such a horrible, poor language? Is there something else? And then it triggered in me it put me on the journey of self-discovery. And I did that. I started that journey earlier at the age of 21. And by the way, the Soviet Union collapsed. I was strongly in the camp of the Ruch, of the popular movement of Ukraine.
Not surprised.
Yes, and quite vocal and outspoken. But I did go through the same transformation in a way. So bouncing your question back to you, there are different views of what it means to be Ukrainian today. One, and I'm talking now about identity and language. One view, which probably is traditional, there's no surprise, you can't be Ukrainian without speaking Ukrainian. Just as well, you cannot be French without speaking French, or Italian without speaking Italian, Russian without speaking Russian, Poles without speaking Polish. That's a traditional view. Now, another view is kind of aggressively propounded and advocated, that you can be Ukrainian without speaking Ukrainian, that you don't necessarily have to speak Ukrainian, you can be Russian speaker speaking Ukrainian. And ex-President Poroshenko famously said that you can love Ukraine in Russian equally, with equal passion as you love Ukraine in Ukrainian. And my question to you is, where are you on that spectrum of opinions?
For myself or in general?
In general. Let's not be personal.
No, of course, the country has its language and they should speak Ukrainian. I was recently facing the discussion about it, and it was related to the work that I do here in America. And we brought Forbes magazine, the brand, to Ukraine after a little break. And there was a question in what language the magazine should be published. Mm-hmm. And the editor and the publisher of the magazine, with his team, decided to publish in 2 languages. They decided to do 2 editions, not just half and half, or some articles are in Russian, some are in Ukrainian. They decided to publish 2 separate, same content in Ukrainian and in Russian. They hired some really skilled linguists to help them to elevate their Ukrainian language, because there's not much quality business media in Ukrainian, and certain terminology actually, they're basically discovering it as they go. So they put a lot of effort into making the Ukrainian version very sophisticated, and also occasionally on social media, they even do little linguistic blurbs, like explaining like what this word means, or you can use this word, but there is a better Ukrainian word for that. So they totally support, but they didn't want to be divisive in that sense. They didn't want to single out, or didn't want to make it in any way like a point of debate. So listening to what they say, living there, being extremely pro-Ukrainian and extremely loving the country and hoping for better future and doing a lot to make that future better. Realistically, you need to know Ukrainian, and it's a beautiful language and it sounds wonderful. And it has a very different, like when I speak about it, it has a very different correlation with everything, and even color and the way it sounds. But in a lot of Eastern cities, people still speak Russian. So at this point, I think let them speak Russian if they want to, but they speak Ukrainian too. They understand Ukrainian, they read in Ukrainian. And the common answer that I hear when I ask similar question with people in Ukraine, they actually say that very often you do make a point, like you need to know Ukrainian, you need to speak Ukrainian. But in reality, a lot of people who used to be Russian speakers, they say that they don't really tell the difference sometimes. They answer in Ukrainian, they answer in Russian, they converse in 2 languages. It doesn't become a divisive, like a political kind of division for them.
Very well. And we have a question from Oksana Piasecki, and I quote, "Very interesting discussion, one that needs to be developed further for the future of Ukraine. will your movie be shown in Ukraine?
That's a great question. I honestly do not know yet, because when I showed it to a couple of people of more like Ukrainian, like living in Ukraine, they're not as fascinated with this whole history thing because they lived it, they know it. But I also understand that there are a lot of younger people now who never lived that, and they could actually be interested in watching it. So at the moment, I'm not having any screenings lined up, but if you have any ideas or anyone has any ideas, I'm open to any discussions. I think the more people watch it, the better. For me as a filmmaker, I would like to find the audience, and I would like to step outside of, just American audience in New York or in more like in the cities. I actually want to show it in deep America, somewhere further away from the coast, or European countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc. The same thing. Young people don't know anything about what it was like living behind the Iron Curtain, according to some surveys that were done. So I do hope to show it, even though it does seem like they're familiar, but I think there is audience for that as well.
The practical question is, do you have a Ukrainian language version of the film?
I'll make one in no time.
That's a good question. That's a very good answer. And I am of the opinion that the film should be also screened in Russia. That's a very good film for Russians to watch, a very instructive one. Did you ever entertain that idea?
Not really, not yet. But you've given me ideas.
No, I'm being very, very serious. I think the film would be of, I have this theory that somebody has to help Russians to become a modern nation, to exit the framework of mind that is 19th century, that is imperial. And the more help we offer them, and your film is of great help, the better is for Russian. So every criticism of Russia is such help, because otherwise they don't seem to have it within them to manage modernization. They seem to be going back in time, mind-wise and stuff. We have a question that I received by mail, believe it or not snail mail, but to my mailbox. Yes, people are very inventive, and it's Alex Labunka, a good friend, and he is with us. So hi, Alex. Thank you for the question. Two questions. If you can please ask Katya, and I'm asking her, does she interact at all with Ukrainian post-war emigres and Ukrainian Americans born here? If she does, how is their focus on integration, assimilation, or isolation differ from her current experience?
Of integration with what?
I believe he meant their integration and assimilation within the American society. The fact that Ukrainians proved to be very resistant to losing their identity. They were very careful at preserving their language, their culture, and being kind of on the one hand integrating in American society, but not at the expense of losing their identity. They have their cultural societies, their scientific societies, their credit unions, and stuff like that. So what do you think of that?
Well, they have very good reasons to preserve their identity. And I think historically, they preserved a lot more of that Ukrainian culture that was killed in regions like Kharkiv, for instance. Again, my conversations with people in Minneapolis, with Walter, who is in the film, and then Luda Anastasievska, she watched the film and we talked. They're integrated in American society to the point that they feel comfortable. You know, they teach at American schools or they work for American companies. They speak fluent English. They are part of American life, but preserving their own culture, I think it's an amazing and admirable thing to do. So I think in America, a lot of people are from somewhere and a lot of people preserve their cultural identity. And if you don't hang out in those enclaves and just sort of like sit on some, I mean, I have no I don't want to offend anyone, but sometimes people stay too long on government assistance and they try to game the system. That's very different from, you know, preserving your cultural heritage and also working and living and enjoying everything that America has to offer and contributing into American society. So I hope I answered that question. It's just my view based on my conversation with people, but I don't know what they think. Maybe it's something to write about.
And his second question is in a way connected territorially, geographically with the first one. It pertains to America. How does Katya view the level of knowledge of non-Ukrainian Americans about Ukraine, its current situation, history, and culture?
Sadly, Americans need to see my film because without it, they really have very limited knowledge of what's happening in that part of the world. And the current news cycle does not help. There are some buzzwords that appear everywhere on mainstream channels, and then they disappear. And the picture of Ukraine is not in any way fuller or better just because we had the president impeached and everybody was talking about the call with the Ukrainian president. It's not contributing towards knowledge of Ukrainian culture and what they are. People still say, and it's a horrible thing to realize, but people still say Russia when they talk about Ukraine in some regions, not as much as before, but it's still, oh, you know, it's whatever. They're Russian. They're like from Uzbekistan, they're Russians. They're, you know, from Belarus, they're Russians. They're from Ukraine, they're Russians. It's like, it's very, very hard to break that stereotype. And all the, I mean, I think the way for Americans to learn about Ukraine would be through Ukrainian cultural contribution, contemporary art or contemporary film, documentary film. This is a much better way to kind of, educate American general public. But in order for them to pay attention to that, it needs to be somehow delivered to these markets where people just want to see good film, and it's not just specifically about Ukraine. And that's how they would know more about this, our beautiful country and culture. And just to base like on my journalistic experience, America is so far from Ukraine and people care about so many different things. It's not easy to deliver accurate information about the culture, and especially with all the political flavor that's been constantly messing with it.
And the question from Alexandra Lerman, I quote, "The film is so important and timely. Who do you think of as your primary audience for the film? As a Russian person, it really helped me understand the quote breakup as I witnessed my extended family in St. Petersburg fall apart over the Crimea invasion. At the same time, I can imagine that it is also very timely for the US audience before the elections here. Can you speak to that?"
Thank you, Alexandra, so much for your question. Yeah, Crimea definitely served as a breaking point for a lot of families and friendships. And I'm afraid that I won't be able to show this film before the elections to a wider American audience. It's just very hard to break through, especially with COVID. There are no opportunities for screenings. Otherwise, I would be screening it in communities around the country. But I reached out to several different organizations, including Ukrainians, but not limited to. And it looks like screenings in person are impossible. And for online, it's harder to get audience when there is no physical space and physical community to attract. So unfortunately, before the elections, this film probably won't be shown, but I do want a general American audience or general Western audience to see this film, because I feel like the Iron Curtain came down and there is all this mess happening in Europe, coming from, unfortunately, your home country, Russia, the government of Russia, I would say, that it's very hard in this kind of messy informational, cacophony, is that even the word, to see a bigger picture but I think the story of Ukraine illustrates it very well. And the audience, as much as we all, people who are from Ukraine or from former Soviet Union can feel or identify in some ways with this film, I think general American audience, and I actually tested it in some people who have nothing to do with the Soviet Union, they were fascinated with this film because they've heard something in the news over these several decades, right? The wall came down, Ukraine has some revolution, but then they have it all laid out in front of them, and they're like, wow, we didn't even know how people experienced it on a personal level. It's not just the news, it's not just big words, geopolitical fights, it's actually real people affected by that. Historically, going back to long time ago, Holodomor, people don't know about Holodomor. How do you not know? There were 6 to how many, approximately million people just killed by Stalin right around the time when the United States recognized the Soviet Union as a separate country. That's my understanding. It's like these things were happening not that long time ago, and not even 100 years ago. And people don't know about this. So I really hope that whoever sees this film will get something that's useful, not just, entertainment, but also a little knowledge.
And we are flooded with questions. So there's an which I love. I love questions. Anonymous attendee asking, writing, you are very talented and honest. Will you please continue this very topic with more movies or media presentations and writings? So many people need to understand this topic of Ukrainian identity. Your experience really talks to us.
Thank you so much, anonymous person. I would love to. I mean, they say do what you know, so apparently that's what I know. I mean, honestly, there is so much, and if it's not just me, Yuri, if you start just going down the maze of the memories, there is so much weird stuff there that we thought was normal. And it's not just the period of communism, but even after, the confusion, the misconceptions, the fake history that they taught us in schools. It's endless. So I'm happy to keep exploring that. And also, it's not about the film, but when I published that memoir essay, and a lot of people read it, and even though I published it 2 years ago, people still read it. Recently, I just got somebody contacting me about it. People from America find something in that, because they were on this side of the Iron Curtain and they were afraid of the Soviets, and they really didn't know how we lived. And for them to read the memories of this brainwashed communistic past was actually, for some reason, very interesting and connecting with their own experiences as children when they were expecting the Soviets to send the nuclear bomb. So yeah, I agree. It's endless gold mine. Thank you.
And we have a question from Elliot Lieberman from Baltimore. It's an observation and a question. There appears to be interesting overlap between the film's conclusion and that expressed in a September 20th, 2016 Harriman Institute seminar by Mykola Ryabchuk of Ukraine. As I recall, after going through a bunch of demographic and polling analysis, Mykola Ryabchuk concludes that across the spectrum of Russian and Ukrainian speakers in Ukraine and across the full political spectrum, the single most important observation is that the war in eastern Ukraine seems to have resulted in a growing sentiment in support for Ukraine as an independent country, no matter differences in defining what the country looks like. Questions for Katya and then Yurko, that's me. Am I correct that this is also one of the film's concluding observations? And number 2, if so, does Katya or myself have any sense of whether between 2016, when Ryabchuk made his observation, and today, when the film concludes similarly, this sentiment has increased?
Well, Yuri, I wasn't there in 2016, so maybe I will let you lead this answer, and then I will maybe piggyback or add my comments.
Well, in answer to the first question, I'm not in a position to answer, but my impression is that your film suggests that this is also the conclusion, that the Russian aggression was a catalyst for greater support for independence Ukraine, even in Kharkiv, among people there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the impression that I get. And, you know, in your personal experience, I suppose it was also a catalyst to that effect, that it strengthened your kind of resolve in supporting independent Ukraine. As far as the kind of sentiment now and in 2016, I am not in command of the polling data, so I'd be amiss pretending that I can answer that question. So I'll just let it stay unanswered for fear of being on the wrong. And we have a question from an interesting triple question from Basil Lvov. Another question, if I may. I'll play the devil's advocate. The Russian aggression against Ukraine had to do, among other things, with Russia's desire to unify the country that no longer exists, meaning the Soviet Union, right? What Russia can't understand is that the breakup with Ukraine has been long overdue. Now, Ukraine also wants to see itself unified, while there was much tension between the West and the East of the country long before 2014, and the attempts to Ukrainianize the Russian-speaking part of the country played a role in this as well. And the question is, what's the difference between Ukraine and Russia as far as unification is concerned? Is the comparison legit? And how do the characters of the film, including your immediate relatives, feel about the East-West opposition now?
Well, the first one, the last part of the question is very easy. They don't think that there is any opposition. I just spoke about this with my mother like 2 days ago. And they don't feel that there is any opposition, even though she's in Kharkiv, and yes, they're closer. They're like half an hour there in Russia, half an hour drive. But people, they don't have, I mean, I'm sure there are radicals everywhere, but nobody is talking about those like tiny groups, if they exist even. I don't know. But they don't feel that the West is different from them. And based on my conversations with people in the West, they don't feel that the East Ukrainians are different. So no opposition. I mean, I can't speak for everyone, right? But I'm just trying to say what I hear just from 2 days ago, speaking to somebody who lives in Kharkiv. Mm-hmm. In terms of, what was the first part?
The tension between East and West of the country in Ukraine contributed to this kind of what was going on. The question is, what's the difference between Ukraine and Russia as far as unification is concerned? Is the comparison legitimate? And how do the characters of the film, including your immediate relative, feel about the East and West? That you answered that. Mm-hmm.
But I have something to add a little bit about what is Ukraine and, you know, something along those lines. You just know it when you, I mean, I'm sure there's like theory and some better explanations, more scientifically ground, but even just an example, and it's just my experience, but I'm positive that there are other people who had similar experiences. When there was the Soviet Union and I was a little girl and it was this big, wonderful, amazing country, the Soviet Union, quote unquote, I'm joking. I mean, I'm sarcastic, but I went to Russia every summer. I went to Russia for like 2 months. Not for a second, they accepted me in that little village as a Russian. They were making, I'm sorry, but they were making fun of me, of my accent, of me being from Ukraine. I never got upset or offended because it was just part of day-to-day, you know, life, and they were my friends and family and everything was fine. But even people who would come for the summer to visit their grandparents from the Far East in Russia, they were still accepted as Russians. But was from Kharkiv, and it was enough for them to single me out as a different nation at that time, like republic, I don't know, nationality. At the same time, I went to Belarus for the remainder of the summer, where my grandparents lived. It was a separate country. They spoke separate language. They had different, words that they used, different poets. If you traveled enough, even at that time when everything was Russified and you were open to paying attention to those differences, you could tell that, they used to be separate, separate countries or separate states, but it's not Russia.
And I wanted to engage with this part of excellent question by Basil Lvov, and I'll repeat it again. Now that Ukraine wants to see itself unified, while there was much tension between the West and the East of the country long before 2014, and the attempts to Ukrainianize the Russian-speaking part of the country played the role in this as well. So my answer is it's a very widespread stereotype of presenting Ukraine as a deeply divided country, which is very far from the truth. Western journalists are deeply or greatly tempted by easy dichotomies, East and West, Catholic East, Orthodox West. I'm talking about Ukraine, Ukrainian-speaking West, Russian-speaking East, but the country is much more complex and complicated, and the religious divisions are much subtler, and there is presence of different churches all around Ukraine. The countryside in Ukraine almost everywhere speaks Ukrainian, including in the Donbass and around Kharkiv and Sumy, the areas that are journalists like to present as singularly Russian-speaking. And Ukraine, like some of the most prominent Ukrainian writers, like Vasil Stus, like Serhiy Zhadan, they come, guess from where? From supposedly completely Russian Ukraine, Russian language Ukraine. That's a very kind of simplified and vulgar representation of the country that people do not kind of take it upon themselves to study properly, to do their home assignment before writing something about Ukraine. As far as Ukrainianization of Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, that's another kind of myth of Russian propaganda and the propaganda of beholden to the Kremlin emanating from oligarchic media within Ukraine. Because if there was such a Russification, Ukrainianization in predominantly Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, how come there were no Ukrainian schools in the Crimea? How come the majority of schools in Donbass were nominally Ukrainian language speaking, but in fact were speaking Russian? And the students were poorly trained, they spoke Russian, and nobody really cared about that. So the situation is much more complex and much more kind of finessed, and this approach, in that sense, Ukraine is not more divided than is the United States of America between blue and red, than is multinational Russia, than Spain with all its separatism, or than Great Britain. But the rhetoric about the deeply divided Ukraine is very convenient for Russian kind of plans of first regaining the so-called predominantly Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, so as to kind of make the first step of disposing of independence of Ukraine completely. So I'm glad Basil posed that question so that we could kind of answer it in the way that I just did, because the question really deserves an entire conference. The false and the latest, literally yesterday, I came across the information that Paul Manafort, who consulted Viktor Yanukovych and kind of was architect of Yanukovych's electoral victory in 2012, proposed to divide Ukraine into two parts, so as to provide the victory, the electoral victory, to Yanukovych in media, in the propaganda and agitation during the election period. We have a question from Rachel Eads, which is a practical question, coming from Baltimore. Love your film. How can our friends in US see it?
Oh, it's a good question. This Saturday, there is going to be a film screening at the Eastern Oregon Festival, but now everything is online, so it doesn't really matter, the geographical boundaries. I don't know how to really give you the link to that festival. There will be other wonderful films screened, and my film is available as of tomorrow for a couple of days. And then there is a Q&A session on Saturday at 9:30 New York time, Eastern Standard Time. So if you maybe Google the Long Breakup Eastern Oregon Festival, stuff will come out. So that would be one of the ways to watch. And after that, I will work on, future plans.
So what happened with your breakup with Lenin, Gabriela Gonzalez?
Thank you. That one is over. That one is totally over. This is not, it took a while, right? I broke up with Lenin somewhere halfway, not when the statue came down, but, and anyway, I don't know how much time we have left. We probably don't, because my stories are endless. In my memoir-based essay that is on Forbes.com, I actually have a story about breaking up with Lenin, and it describes the episode when I just basically ruined some kind of pro-Lenin discussion at the school where I went. And I just came back from some trip to Russia, to Moscow, where I was educated. And I just said, Lenin is passé, he was a utopian, he ate lamb when he was in exile, like all the stuff that was in my little head at that time. So I decried him and denounced him when I was 13. So it's over. My romance with Lenin is over.
And there's a question from Chris M. Will the film be available for streaming to a wider audience? Repetitive, you see, people want your film. And how could I show it to my US friends and colleagues?
Well, thank you so much for this question. If any of you have any contacts with Netflix or PBS or Canadian broadcast company that are strong enough to help me at least speak to them and pitch the film, please email me. I'd be happy to use the opportunity, because it's not easy to break into this American market, especially with such a niche film.
Okay, and a question from Andriy Pereklita. Thank you for a very personal and important examination of 30 years of independence in Ukraine. I would like to know if you surprised yourself at the growing national identity you portray in your immediate family and your own growing recognition of your incredibly strong identity rooted in Kharkiv and Ukraine.
Thank you. I am surprised a little bit. I wasn't really thinking much. I just wanted to finish the film, and I was watching the events developing. So I was, it's not like I'm thinking, what is it gonna mean for me or for my identity? I was just immersed into making this film. But also, all the participants today are such an intelligent and sophisticated audience. So you make me think about all these things, but I probably wasn't even aware that some of those elements were in that film. So yeah, I was a little bit surprised.
And we have our last question tonight from Elsa Butler. Great job, Katya. I watched your film as a born and bred American and enjoyed it very much. The scene at the TV station in which the electricity was turned off by a political rival to the station's owner was powerful. You made the point that it became clear to Ukrainian politicians that control of the media was a very important tool to wield. Do you see parallels here in the United States? Do you see the use of propaganda and/or the attempt to control political messaging through media more or less nuanced here?
Oh my God, Elsa, thank you so much for this question, because this is partially why I was trying so hard to break, and I couldn't break because of COVID, into American screenings at this time, because the parallels to me and to some of the people who saw the film and talked to me after that are there. It's almost astonishing how you see what's happening to the United States in the effort of manipulate the elections or incite violence or disagreements and racism between the people, and what Russia was doing in Ukraine. And even at that time, I was saying that, you know, America is such a diverse country. If somebody decides to mess with that, all these states, they represent so many different populations and cultures and traditions, it's not going to be that difficult. And look what's happening. And that's probably not the end of it. We don't know after the election what's going to happen, but the country is polarized and is divided in some ways artificially, because if you keep pushing the messages for now, what, 4 years, a little bit over 4 years, that divide people, yeah, people are going to start, you know, kind of drifting apart, even though they lived fairly well together for many years. Attempts to corrupt the institutions, that's like absolutely close to what happened in Ukraine during the Yanukovych government, or even, you know, continues now. Yeah, I mean, I think Americans should watch this film, and they should watch it now, yesterday, so they know at least maybe somehow they will connect the dots and they will see what's happening. But, you know, maybe for the next election.
All right. And another question, if you please, what is the... And well, this question I think was already answered. So do you have my kind of wrapping up question in a way natural, given the fact that you have developed quite a following and people, and there's a demand.
It's your following, Yuri. I'm just here.
There's a demand for more. Is there any new film in the works? Have you entertained an idea or the idea of making a sequel or a film, another film on whatever subject?
I don't have anything in works right now, but I do have several ideas in my head, mostly some on paper, for, you know, to continue exploiting that theme. And it doesn't have to be political in some ways, but the stories will be related to Ukraine in the 90s, you know, that era, the conflict or the discoveries. So nothing to announce yet.
Well, Katya, thank you so much for a great film. And I wish the best of luck to you in promoting it and bringing it to as many people as can be, because it needs to be watched both in Ukraine, in the United States, in the West at large, and in Russia. I hope at one point it will be available on YouTube or on some kind of platform that is accessible, easily accessible, where they're paid for, or it doesn't matter. It matters, I mean, I suppose it matters for you to recuperate the funds and stuff, but the main point is that I hope the film is available. Thank you so very much. Thank you for making the film and for this wonderful discussion. And thank you all of our participants. Now at this point, there are 44 of them, for taking the time to join us at the Ukrainian Film Club of Columbia University event. Our next event is planned for November 18th, also Wednesday. I am working on something, hopefully, which is a tall order, no less exciting than the film that we discussed today. And I will try to announce it as soon as possible. Again, thank you all, and good night, and come again.
Can I say goodbye?
Absolutely.
To the participants?
Yes, yes.
Yuri, thank you so much for letting me come with my film to your club. And I want to thank everyone who participated and watched the film, or those who watched the film but couldn't join us today. I honestly did not expect that much interest. but I think you probably are the most sophisticated audience that I will ever have for this film, because you're so knowledgeable and so insightful. And I appreciate all the questions. And if you have any questions or any proposals, any screenings you want, or somebody would want to have, anything, you can find me on Facebook. There is a page called The Long Breakup, and you can reach us through that, or just Katya Soldak. If you Google, there's like Twitter and everything. So I'm interested in connecting with you and in spreading the word or showing the film. So thank you again. And I think that was probably the best virtual premiere I could expect